to this webinar series, the Friday webinar series, which we do on the Indian economy as well as important contemporary issues. We are a think tank which focuses on policy-oriented research and research-based policy advice. That is the think tank focused on. It's a new think tank, about 3 years old, and our chairman is Dr. Arvind Virmani, who will be chairing your session. Let me introduce briefly Dr. Arvind Virmani. Dr. Arvind Virmani was the Chief Economic Advisor of Government of India as well as the Executive Director at the IMF. He has, apart from chairing our think tank, he is also the president of the Forum for Strategic Initiatives in Delhi. He has been a mentor for economic policy to FICCI. It's a trade body, important trade body in our country, and member of RBI Technical Advisory Committee on Monetary Policy. He was the principal advisor in the Planning Commission, erstwhile Planning Commission, and he has served as member Telecom Regulatory Authority of India, directed the Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations, EGROW. Sweta must be familiar with this.
Yes, I am.
As its chief executive, he has published 35 journal articles, 20 chapter books, 20 chapters in books, and written more than 50 other working papers in the areas of macroeconomics, growth and finance, tax reform, international trade and tariffs, international relations, and national security strategy. He is very active on Twitter, and he is India's finest policy maker, and government does consult him all the time. With this, I hand over to Dr. Arvind Virmani to chair the session and take the proceedings further.
Thank you, Chan, for those kind words. Let me, as I understood it, this is a report that UN-ESCAP has done on COVID in Asia and what are the implications for policy after this. So we have three presenters, Hamza Malik, who's the director of the macroeconomic policy department of ESCAP. There is Sweta Saxena, who's the division chief of the macro policy division, and Lin Zhu, who is associate economic affairs officer in the same division. So with that, let me invite you to speak. Are you going to make a PowerPoint?
I'll start with some very basic few remarks to set the scene, and then my colleagues Shweta and Lynn actually will take you through the detailed presentation.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Virmani. Thank you, Dr. Charan Singh, for organizing this event with us. This is part of our ongoing effort in trying to increase our outreach to think tanks in Asia Pacific region. And it's good to get in touch with new think tanks, new colleagues we can partner with in this endeavor. The reason, I mean, this is the work that has been done by my team, led by Shweta, and I think most colleagues are here. Lynn is definitely part of that team. Just to give you a few basic observations for your interest and those of the participants, some of you may already be aware of what the Economic and Social Survey of Asia Pacific is. This is one of the oldest publication of its kind in the regions in print since 1947. Long before World Bank and IMF and ADB and others started producing region-wide economic assessments. So it has a long tradition, and we are very proud of this tradition and trying to continue moving forward. Over time, of course, the emphasis, focus, style has gone on, as expected, many changes. And I'd like to share what kind of research we are trying to do and why we're doing that. And then, of course, my colleagues will take you some very specific research that we have done in this particular issue. So what Shweta and I have been actually trying to, I always call her my partner in crime. So we've been trying to push conventional economic assessment. I mean, there are so many reports out there when you look at either at the region or for the country level that policymakers can access to. So we have been discussing and thinking among ourselves, what is the value addition of our publication? What is our niche? So broadly, we define our research theme, what I like to call it, thinking beyond GDP growth. It's a different way of saying, I mean, we can say it differently. We can call it economic assessment for sustainable development, or few of the economic transformation for resilient, inclusive, and sustainable development. But basically, the idea is policymakers, economists should not only focus on economic growth dynamics when it comes to understanding what's going on in terms of the state of the economy. That's the very overarching, broader kind of research theme. And within that, we are going ahead with several strands. So there's three broad ways we are trying to, as I was saying, push the boundaries a little bit of research. One is more on the theoretical and conceptual front. And here we have been simply teasing, getting the message out there, primarily to academic economists and researchers, but indirectly, of course, to policymakers as well, because that's our primary audience. And we have been sort of critical of the mainstream economic thinking on multiple grounds. We have questioned, for instance, the validity or continued insistence on the role of self-interest in trying to find the underpinnings of policymaking. We have been critical of efficiency or too much emphasis on efficiency, especially when it comes to comparing or assessing trade-offs between efficiency and resilience, for instance. Similarly, we have been critical of the, again, excessive focus on the role of markets or too much emphasis given by businesses in particular for profit maximization. Now, we are all trained economists in my team, including myself and Shweta. We understand the value of these concepts, and we are certainly in favor of these. But our point is there is far too much emphasis on these things, and at times it comes at a cost. And it has actually come at a cost, which we have been trying to document in a systematic manner. For instance, in a very simple manner, the economic growth that the Asia-Pacific region has experienced last 2-3 decades, for instance, in particular, has come at a cost of rising, very high and rising inequalities, and both horizontal and vertical inequalities. It has had already a fairly damaging impact on the environment, and which is not going to be helped by ongoing climate change that is a major global issue, right? So this is just to give you an example. So we have been trying to say, okay, let's not continue to pursue mainstream economic thinking when it comes to policy advice. That's a more of a conceptual thinking. Then the second thing we do is we try and add a little bit of value to when we come to conventional economic assessments. So for instance, we do discuss growth dynamics of an economy, but we always highlight or try to highlight the linkages between economic growth and its quality. More specifically, we try and understand the relationship between economic growth and employment generation or decent work, for instance. To which extent economic growth is helpful for reducing poverty, if that's the only factor. To what extent the kind of growth is taking place, is it exacerbating inequalities or is it helpful for inequalities? What kind of consumption and production patterns are there in the sense whether they are helpful or harmful for the environment? So we try to sort of go a little bit beyond when they're saying, well, GDP growth is all stable and fine and growing. However, and then we add a few of the assessments depending on the particular theme we want to go after a bit more in detail. Similarly, we have been trying to, and we have touched upon on the role of mainstream macroeconomic policies, like monetary and fiscal policies. Do they have a role in addressing broader sustainability concerns, such as inclusivity, such as environment degradation? There are new research themes now, nexus between monetary policy and inequality, for instance. Monetary policy and climate change actually already is becoming a fairly hot topic from multiple angles. So these are very new areas which are now mainstream economists are beginning to concede that traditional macroeconomic policies can go beyond that. And we have been trying to sort of nudge the conversation in that direction. So we'd like to summarize this part of our assessment always as growth or economic growth is necessary, but it's not sufficient. And that tends to be our message repeated in multiple manners, depending on the issue, particular aspect we are highlighting or going in detail of. The third part of our research strategy we try to follow is, in addition to the conceptual theoretical commentary or criticism and pushing the boundaries of conventional economic thinking or conventional economic assessment of economies, the third part is where we do the bulk of our hardcore research as behavioral economists. And that's where we try to show, okay, we are critical of the economic thinking. We are not fully satisfied with stopping at assessing growth potential or growth outlook. we're going to go beyond that. And beyond that is, as UN, we'll keep an eye on the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development in specific terms, or the prospects of sustainable development as a whole. Now, all of you already know sustainable development actually is a fairly broad term. So is the 2030 Agenda. Sustainable development goals, for instance, encompass almost all sorts of development issues. So they are like a bit of a utopian world that the policymakers want to go after. As economists, our role is, well, it's easy to say we should provide social protection to all. It's easy to say, let's bring poverty back to zero. It's very easy to say every citizen should have access to health services and so on and so forth. These are advocacy kind of messages. The difference between, in my understanding, of typical commentators who highlight the importance of these issues by emphasizing what I was just saying, and economists is we actually go out and show how. Is it feasible? What are the implications? What are the trade-offs? Is it possible? How are you going to finance some of the initiatives that are required to undertake these policies? What if you change policies? Are there going to be any other unforeseen adverse implications, and so on and so forth? So that's become the analytical assessment that we try to pursue. So what we have done in this particular issue, the Economic and Social Survey of 2021, which was published in, I think, end March, 30th, 31st March. And between then and June or July, we'll be engaging with think tanks, researchers, and other such community in the Asia Pacific region. So what we've done here is what we call a essentially looking forward, a build forward policy package. So we have discussed, and my colleagues will take you through the details exactly what are the main contours of that policy packages, how do we assess them in terms of a formal macroeconometric model, and what are our main results, and what are the fundamental messages for the policymakers in the region based on this research. So this year, our focus essentially, of course, was in the context of COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of emphasis on a discussion on trying to build resilience there, and then taking it forward. Once you build resilience, how you want to transform the economies so we don't encounter the devastating impacts that we just experienced in the aftermath of COVID-19. So that's just to give you a flavor or teaser, so to speak, of kind of research we do and what we have done in this particular year. And it would be great if we can remain in touch and continue to collaborate outside these kind of webinars, or even more some specific joint research. I think that's the whole idea, to sort of try and share what kind of research we do. I'm sure in your think tank, there are colleagues who are probably researching on similar issues. So I stop here and hand over to my colleague Shweta and then Lynn. So thank you so much for the opportunity once again from my end. Over to you, Shweta.
Okay, thank you, Hamza. And thank you, Charan, actually, for inviting us to do this presentation. And thank you, Dr. Virmani, for actually chairing this. Hamza has already given a lot of background about what we do in the survey, actually, and how our survey, our flagship report is quite different from what the IMF produces, the World Bank, ADB, and AMRO, and all these other institutions do. So without dwelling on any of these matters further, let me just give you a couple of key messages from our report. First, so Lynn, can you share the slides? Are they already? Can you share the slides? Yes. So let me give you the key messages, and then we'll go a little bit deeper into the survey, actually. So now we all are still going through the COVID pandemic. It isn't over until it's over. So it's actually, we all understand that it's leaving massive scars on the social economic fabric of every economy. When you look around the world, not just this region. So its impacts, however, we believe that have been amplified due to lack of resilience and investment in people and planet. Those were some of the main reasons, actually, why some of the countries have suffered more than others. Second, as we begin to plan the recovery phase, policy support, we believe, must continue to focus on building resilience and investing in the 2030 agenda, something that Hamza was talking about just a minute ago. Now, since Asia Pacific is prone to shocks, this is not the first shock Asia Pacific has experienced. We've had both economic and non-economic shocks back in the past. And so we learned from this report that economic shocks tend to have an impact on social and environmental aspects, and non-economic shocks have an impact on the economy. So just for instance, the pandemic, which is actually a non-economic shock, it's taking a huge toll on the economy. Who doesn't know that, right? So here we argue that we need a more integrated risk management approach to planning and policy making. And now, keeping all these interlinkages at the back of our minds, between economic, social, and environmental aspects, basically, we propose a policy package which we call Building Forward Better. It calls for investing in social services, digital access, and green development. Now, it's all hunky-dory. It's very nice to actually be investing in this, but this all, of course, does require a lot of money, basically. So this package will show you how it brings massive gains by reducing poverty and reducing carbon emissions. But of course, since it requires money, that means we have to actually build some fiscal space. So where are we going to get the money from? And we explore a range of financing options here. So the way we've organized the report, the very first part actually talks about the present, the pandemic, the macroeconomic situation right now. Then we go a little bit in the past and look at the past economic and non-economic shocks we've experienced and what are the lessons we've learned from there. And then we go into the future a little bit and say, how can we recover from this current pandemic a little bit better, where we experience more inclusive, green, and resilient, basically, recovery. So this is the structure of the report, and I'll hand it over to Lynn, who's going to actually present. We'll go through a little bit of the more details on this report now. So over to you, Lynn. I can't hear you, Lynn.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me now? Hello?
Yes, I can hear you now.
All right.
Great little, but yeah, we can hear you.
Yes.
All right. So thank you, Sweta, for giving the main message of our survey today. So now let's look into the detail of our survey. First, let's look into the present scenario. We all know that by now that health emergency caused not only social damage, but also entail economic risk. The economic performance in 2020 was Asia Pacific's worst performing in the recent history, with the GDP contracting by 1% on top of its 2 years gradual decelerations in 2018 and 2019. The differences between 2018 and 2020 highlight the worldwide impact of the COVID-19 and its adverse effect on the economic performance of the regions. Besides economic contraction, COVID-19 also imposed significant social costs. The lockdown and the associated measure result in a loss of an equivalent to 140 million full-time jobs over the years of 2020, estimated by the ILO. And the lockdown also affecting many low-income and informal workers. As you can see from the chart on the right, ESCAP estimates that 89 million people could have been pushed back into extreme poverty, meaning living less than $1.9 per day. And if we raise the bar to $3.2 and $5.5 per day, the figure would rise to 158 million and 172 million. Given such considerable uncertainty, we are cautiously optimistic for 2021 and 2022. For developing Asia Pacific region as a whole, the GDP is expected to grow by 5.9% in 2021, and much of this bounce back will be driven by the low base in 2020. We are more cautious in assuming high speed of vaccine rollout or recovery, given such a big range of uncertainty. By 2020, we cautiously expect the GDP growth of the whole developing Asian Pacific to return to 5.0%. Now, if we zoom into South and Southwest Asia, the economic recessions was much more severe in this region due to more severe and prolonged pandemic outbreaks, exposing some of the structural vulnerability of the regions. First, there is this pre-pandemic economic challenge and economic decelerations in some countries in this region, like India, Pakistan, and Turkey. And this region has also highly depends on labor-intensive and contact-intensive traditional service and manufacturing sectors, which took a big hit during the pandemic. There is also large shares of informal economic activities in the region, which are more severely impacted by the lockdown measures. Several countries in the sub-region highly depend on international tourism, such as Bhutan, Nepal, Sri Lanka. Such optimistics for the GDP forecast for the whole regions is supported by multiple factors. First, unlike the damage from natural disasters or financial crisis, which destroy infrastructure or are a result of underlying weakness in the economies, the damage from COVID-19 tend to be relatively temporary. Second, the vaccine rollout has been started in the region, which could further accelerate the recovery. Third, many of the stimulus package deployed in 2020 are supposed to be multi-year program, and we do expect such policy to stay accommodated in next few years. Fourthly, a strong export and regional value chain offer a buffer to the external shock. And finally, major economy worldwide are gradually recovering, as such offering some hope for the futures. On the other hand, risks are still due to the downside. The success vaccine depends immensely on the speed of progress and also the willingness of people to take the jab. Just before this presentation, I checked the vaccination progress in India. So as I can see, the share of the people who receive at least one dose of COVID-19 vaccine in India is about 14%, which is relatively low compared to many other countries in the world. And bearing in mind that this figure is the people who receive at least one dose, meaning that they may not have complete the vaccination, because a lot currently most of the vaccine will require you to receive at least 2 doses in order to consider the immune or relatively immune from the disease. And uncertainty in the vaccination and ongoing lockdown measure also underpin the international tourism, which I just mentioned in the previous slides, a sector on which several Asia-Pacific countries heavily relies on. Another point is fiscal and monetary stimulus for recovery would put burdens on debt, while long-lasting productivity damage will impede a supply-side recovery. Lastly, global capital flow uncertainty and approaching risk of stagflation and lingering trade tension would also add to the downside risk. Bearing in mind that the rebounds that we just saw in the previous slides is the GDP growth rate that may be higher before the pandemic level in 2021 and 2022, but that is because of the lower base. And such recovery in growth rate is not enough to put the region back on its pre-pandemic output trend lines. Some output loss will be permanent in Asia-Pacific developing countries. Here you can see the blue line shows the economic output trend before the pandemic, and the pink dot line shows the forecast recovery path. And we can also see the output loss will equal to 2.6 trillion in Asia-Pacific developing countries. Additionally, by 2022, GDP in half of the Asia-Pacific developing country would still be more than 10% lower than the pre-pandemic trend. Among all these, the most worrisome part is the risk of a K-shaped recovery, which means disproportionate impacts of COVID on the poor and the vulnerable group. This is driven by four main factors. First, which I also mentioned, is the uneven progress in vaccine rollout. And second, the policy space, especially the fiscal one, for supporting a robust recovery over the forecast period, is highly uneven across countries. Those countries incapable of ensuring policy continuity would be highly vulnerable in the recovery process. And the pandemic also bring our attention to the digital and technology divide, which may lead to substantial cross-country divergence because of different adaptation ability to the new normal in the post-pandemic economies, such as the access to distant learning and teleworking. So what exactly can be done in the midst of these uncertain times? ESCAP suggests in the survey three near-term policy priorities. First, containing the pandemic should remain the first and foremost policy priority. Regional and bilateral cooperation could complement global support to developing countries in COVID-19 vaccination program. Second, for a robust recovery, inclusiveness must be prioritized. An inclusive recovery would deliver three benefits. First, it would shorten the pandemic's threats for all. It would also reduce the risk of post-pandemic unrest. And lastly, it is most effectively supports a rebound in aggregated demand. There is also a strong case for continuations of fiscal and monetary support for post-pandemic recovery. It's necessary to consolidate this recovery and to maintain the much-needed support for the poor and the vulnerable group. Continued supports would leverage an economic upswing as fiscal multipliers are usually higher when employment and investments are low during the crisis. We have all experienced the immediate impact of COVID-19. However, the region has also experienced many more shocks in the past. We should all see if we can learn some lessons from the past to build resilience against future shocks. As you can see from this slide, the region has experienced various shocks since 1960s. While the region has managed to reduce the numbers of financial crises, trade shocks, natural disasters, and pandemic has become more frequent. These shocks leave long-term scars on the economies as well as society and environment. For instance, if you look at the charts on the left, the investment rate collapsed after financial crisis and remained below pre-crisis level even after 5 years. The chart in the middle shows that Gini coefficients increased by 0.3% after SARS, H1N1, and MERS. The chart on the right show environmental performance declines from all types of shocks, including natural disasters. But the good news is that policy choices can make a difference. Results from the past shocks show that counter-cyclical monetary and fiscal policies, flexible exchange rates, and social protections are important shock observers. External financing, such as remittance and ODA, mitigate the impacts of these shocks on poverty. Diversified economy also suffer less environmental damage. But pre-existing structural vulnerability can amplify shocks. For instance, let's look at the examples of pandemic, which we are all facing now. While pandemic have a negative economic and social impacts, such impacts was more muted in countries with high public health spending, less vulnerable employments, and high quality infrastructures, which are shown here as the blue lines. And compare with the yellow line, which represent those countries that have low public health spending, widespread vulnerable employment, and low quality infrastructures. We can see that countries with a more robust structures were impacted less by the pandemic. From past crises in the region, we can draw 3 lessons. First, countries should do whatever it takes to safeguard sustainable development in times of crisis. Supporting macroeconomic policies and external financing, together with adequate social services, could reduce setbacks in GDP per capita, human capital, and the environment in the environment. The figures in this slide show the potential boost from such policy measures compared to a too little, too late scenario. Second, risk management should become part and parcel of development planning and policy making. Policymakers should always put in place effective crisis preparations and coping strategy, such as early warning system, and adaptive social protections, insurance, etc. Third is the third lesson that we learned from our study is that it's crucial to strengthen resilience of least developed and other vulnerable countries. When we compare such countries to OECD and other developing countries, along different measures that capture resilience, we will see that least developed countries are behind on almost every aspect. Enhancing physical space for crisis response and addressing deficit in social and physical infrastructures are key priorities. So far, we have seen that any economic recovery remains tentative, and as countries prioritize economic recovery, they tend to intensify the excess focus on economic growth while paying little attention to social and environmental issues. We also learned that adverse shocks had reversed development gains that took decades to accomplish. Countries that were better prepared and respond more swiftly and forcefully suffer less from shocks. Given this background, we propose a policy package in our survey 2021 to build forward better and make countries more resilient, inclusive, and green. Before going into the detail of the proposed policy package, I wanted to emphasize that the region was not on track to fulfill the SDG target by 2030, even before the pandemic. Given the far-reaching socio-economic impact of COVID-19, further delay in reaching the target could be expected, unless there is a fundamental change. This poses the challenge of recovering from the pandemic while also ensuring that such recovery is in line with the SDGs. Available evidence also shows that the region has not fully incorporated social and environmental issues into the recovery package. Most recovery packages are not gender sensitive. Out of the 441 policy measures introduced in 45 economies, only 57 are gender sensitive. And when looking at the breakdown of these recovery policies, we see that only 11% of the physical support for business-related policies is gender sensitive, 40% for social protections, and only 9% of the labor market-related policies are gender sensitive. The chart on the right shows that in many countries, the post-pandemic physical support for energy productions and consumptions are actually being channeled to fossil fuel instead of green and renewable energies. As such, we propose a policy package to build forward better. This package consists of 3 sub-packages. First is the social service package, which enhances access to healthcare and social protections fraud. And digital assets package, which encourage more ICT investment and more spending on education. The green development package invests in energy assets and efficiencies, climate resilient infrastructure, and biodiversity preservation. It also suggests canceling fuel subsidies and introducing a carbon tax. In this policy package, we analyze two spending levels. One is called ambitious level, which is equivalent to the additional investment required to achieve the 2030 agenda. This is the number that we estimated in our 2019 survey. And the other spending level is called business as usual spending. Business as usual. This spending level require a certain portions of the ambitious spending based on each country's past trends of financial resources. On average, the business as usual spending level is about 38% of the ambitious level. And let's look at what building forward better policy package would bring to South and Southwest Asia. As we can see, the ambitious spending model would use significant results, decreasing the number of poor by 120 million. It also reduced inequality, which is measured by Gini coefficient. And environmental benefits of this spending include reductions in carbon emissions by 30% in the long run and a notable improvement in air quality. The impact, while positive, is much smaller under the business as usual scenario. For example, the reduction in the numbers of poor, as you can see in the first chart, is 36 million as compared to 120 million in the ambitious spending. And carbon emissions are cut by 20% as opposed to 30%. While the socioeconomic gains are important for a resilient recovery, this policy package will increase public debt, since we assume an increase in government spending to fight the pandemic, as well as to finance the BFP package. The gray line here show the baseline scenario without BFP or COVID-19 stimulus. And the green line shows the impact of BFP on public debt. The blue line shows the trend of public debt if both build forward better package and COVID-19 spendings are implemented. We can see that for developing Asia Pacific, the government debt ratio is projected to rise steeply from 51% in 2019 to 74% in 2030. We see a similar impact on South and Southwest Asia. The debt ratio is expected to increase from 60% in 2019 to 90% in 2030. But the situation is much worse in least developed countries due to large spending to deliver the BFP package. The debt ratio is expected to more than double from 35% in 2019 to 30% in 2030. So given the build-up of debt, the survey proposed some options to finance this increasing debt. If we look at least developed countries, the immediate challenge is to pay back debt that are maturing. For this, we encourage countries to engage actively in debt relief initiatives. At the moment, only 10 in 24 eligible Asia Pacific countries are participating in DSSI, And among these 11 countries with high debt distress risk, only 6 have participated. The potential saving among 13 non-participating countries are almost 1.4 billion. Second is to make debt work for development more meaningful. Creditor countries should grant more generous financing requirements, and debtor countries should avoid fund fungibility. In the coming years, government will face large fiscal deficits and higher debt. So here we also suggest LDC to explore the possible use of offshore bonds and diaspora bonds based on their country context. For instance, Thailand just lifted registrations on the issuance of unrated foreign bond in the country. The region as a whole can also expand regional scheme to standardize cross-border issuance of financial instruments. The fourth recommendation that we have for LDC is they should also consider incorporating catastrophic risk into their fiscal planning. And for emerging economies as creditors, they should also participate in debt structuring. Much of the official debt in less developed countries now in the region is actually owed to China. Together, the region should consider creating a regional debt platform that involves all creditors. To cope with higher debt, effective public debt management is critical. Countries should adopt transparent debt reporting to show commitment to meet debt obligations and learn from best international practice. In the medium term, countries need to find ways to finance the SDG amid tighter fiscal space. For this, we look at emergency financing mechanism and how we can boost sustainable investment by pension fund and sovereign wealth fund. The untapped asset under management in pension funds and sovereign wealth fund are estimated at least 7.6 trillion. Investment rules governing pension funds are constraining their ability to invest in sustainability in India, for example. The pension funds are not allowed to invest in domestic equity or allowed but with maximum limits, or they are only allowed to invest in equity listed in home or developed markets. So to support the sustainable investing by public institutional investors, investment rules need to be relaxed and financial regulators should agree on common ESG principles and practice. So before I wrap up, let me repeat that the COVID-19 is a unique opportunity to embark on a resilient and sustainable development path. Despite that many uncertainties ahead, the PFP policy package offers tangible policy proposals that can help Asia-Pacific countries to recover from the pandemic and to improve their preparedness for future shocks. We have 3 key takeaways that we hope that you can take after attending the seminar today. First, despite a cautiously optimistic outlook, there is a risk of a K-shaped recovery, and policymakers should prioritize inclusiveness for a robust recovery. Second, policymakers should assess the wider risk landscape and focus on reducing setbacks as well as accelerating progress on sustainable development. Of course, let's seize the opportunity brought by COVID to build forward better. And to this policy package should recovery policy package should adequately focus on social service, digital access, and climate actions, as we emphasize in the policy in our building forward better policy package. Thank you. And this is the end of my presentation. I look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you. I guess if we could remove the, or sorry, you can leave it, but we won't be able to see the people. Anyway, let me start by, I'll make a few comments and leave a few questions before I hand over. I guess Charan, you'll help me with the, or you can do the question later. So let me start, take up some of the points you have. Let me start with planning. So, you know, we have been talking about this very important distinction. I don't know whether you make the distinction, but in India, it's been very, very much neglected. The issue of what is in economics called public health versus personal health. You know, too many people confuse public health with government provided health services, which is an entirely different issue, whether private should provide government hospitals or a mix of the two or whatever, versus public health, which is to do with communicable diseases, vectors which spread diseases, etc. So we have found that this has been grossly neglected, and unless we make that distinction very clear, the general tendency of everybody in India. Oh, sorry, I should have started with one preamble. You know, we have done a lot of work on COVID. So if you are interested, we have about 6 papers on the spread of COVID. And we have 6 to 10 papers on the economics and policy implications of COVID at EGROW. And perhaps Dr. Charan Singh can give you where to find them. But so what my comments are actually based on all our research. That's a preamble, I forgot. Okay, so so in the planning, it is very important. I mean, you know, we are very active on in the public policy space, and I find that maybe 90% of commentators, health experts, do not make that distinction, particularly the NGO and government-oriented type. I think that's a serious mistake because if you just do a general health thing, it will not take care of the next pandemic. So you have to focus on public health issues specifically because the next pandemic may be completely different. It may be waterborne. You know, we don't know. So you have to focus on the public health issues primarily. Of course, that doesn't mean you shouldn't do anything else, but you don't do you know, management of, for example, we have a disaster management authority, but and it's pretty good, but it focused on physical disasters only. Tsunami, they thought, you know, and things like that. And we had a medical disaster. So and when you're talking about future medical disasters, don't think only airborne. Well, it could be waterborne, it could be something else. Okay. So that's the first thing about planning. You know, you have to be very clear. You know, of course, all of us have a tendency to push our own favorite things to solve a problem which we have had in mind. But it's very important for governments to be very clear what is the primary objective, and the general objectives are there. Of course, you know, SDG, etc. is there. Second one is risk management. I think here I missed, you know, I don't know whether your study covers it or you do or don't. We have talked about, you know, the issue of supply chain management. This came up in February, March, supply chain diversification. You know, this came up in March of 2020, where it was found that certain APIs were only produced in, you know, were in a sense monopoly production and export by certain countries. And really, if we are going to talk about risk management, there has to be an element of supply chain diversification, which we have been talking and thinking about a lot. But if you have any comments on that, we would like to hear it. Then the third point I would make is that it's very important to distinguish between, you know, we have shocks all the time. Different shocks have different effects, but the fundamental point about shocks is you have to be able to separate them out. Nothing is perfect. We don't expect perfect separation. But, you know, while I was in government, CA and elsewhere, I mean, the first thing I used to think of when there is a shock of any kind is how much is the permanent effect and what is the change in trend, or what is the permanent effect. So And this is very important again, because people are not doing that. You know, when I keep hearing points about unemployment rates, labor force participation rates, and this data, there's a whole discussion here. And everybody is making their own social, ideological, political points. Nobody is doing the economics. For economics, we need to know how much is temporary, how much is permanent. I mean, as I said, there's no perfect thing, but without having some concept that, okay, maybe 70% of this is temporary and 30 is permanent or something, you can't do any realistic planning. Otherwise, it's just politics and ideology and social grandstanding. I'm sorry, you know, we have to be clear about this. Okay, so on the permanent effect, 2 points. Again, well, one point arising from our own research and the other you mentioned. So when we talk about permanent effect, you know, right from our first paper on the economics of the pandemic, we had, you know, divided the economy into 3 components. One, essential commodities and services, the manufacturing, mining, construction sector, actually the rest of the economy, and the contact services. This is a term we coined in, I think, April. Our first paper, Charan, was probably April, right? Contact services. And the effects are different. You know, they are fundamentally different because, and this is a point we have repeatedly made and has not sunk into too many people who keep discovering it and coming out as if they've learned this and they've, you know, they're brilliant people who just, this was in our first paper. We estimated each of these numbers. We actually estimated the numbers. In our case, because we had a lockdown which exempted essential commodities, it was 10% contact services. We estimated, my memory, I'm getting old, but Charan, do you remember the numbers, exact numbers? I've forgotten, but I think it was, what was it? 50, yeah, 50% for MMS, MMC, and 40 for essential commodities. And then we also got some very rough numbers of employment in each. And the contact services were roughly 10. Of course, we didn't do indirect effects, which is a separate thing, but we just did a simple calculation of as it stood. But we've since discovered there are a lot of indirect effects from contact services. So actually, the effect may be 15%. But and that the share of employment was actually higher in the contact services, in the essential commodities. So the employment effect was less rather than more than the effect on GDP. So that's just an illustration I'm giving. So the point being about permanent and temporary and this confusion, you know, too many people are not distinguishing and therefore getting wrong policy suggestions, which is, you know, something we have been fighting for the last 12 months or so. Okay, so that is the third point. Now, let's see here. Yeah, okay. So here too, in effect, a little bit of questions. If you have any, one is a very simple question, you know, which is that as I said, we've done a lot of work on COVID, and one of the things still remains a puzzle. We don't know enough. You are sitting there and you probably get information from all the countries. And the puzzle is why the rates of cases, you know, the case rate per unit of population is so different across Asia and so much lower in East and Southeast Asian countries. So if you have just general thoughts, you know, it doesn't matter if it's based on research or it's what you heard, you know, what are the reasons? It's been a puzzle for us. You know, we have done a lot of work on this. As I said, you can see if you're interested in India as illustrative of South Asia or whatever, all those papers are there. But this question is still puzzling me a little bit. And finally, the wealth effect, you mentioned K-shape. You know, it's a straightforward wealth effect. Again, this is something I think our second paper said that, you know, in this MMCS sectors, you would have, because they were shut down completely. So 60% of the economy, 50 plus 10, was completely shut down, right? 40 was the essential commodity. So clearly everybody suffered. You know, this is something which I had difficulty explaining to people, that the baseline is that everybody in that sector, whether it's capital, whether it's labor, whether it's it's manual labor or sophisticated labor, everybody is shut down. Okay. On the contrary, on government's urging, some of the poorer, the smaller wage bills were actually carried on, even though they weren't working. People could pay because there were less wages. You know, the higher wage employee actually is very costly. So it's more difficult to say, okay, you continue at 100%. You know, so the baseline was that there's a proportional effect. And as our analysis showed, what that meant was only the wealth effect. That is, obviously, if the poorer person is out of, they are both out of jobs, the better endowed person has a higher savings, which he can draw on and won't go into debt and negative income. So clearly that effect is a wealth effect. It is not the income. The baseline effect is everybody is affected. So, you know, just to give you an example, in India, 90% of employment is roughly what is called informal, right? Informal sector, different definitions and different numbers, 85, 90%. So obviously, if everybody is proportionally affected, you expect 90% of those people to be informal sector. What's so surprising? I mean, I don't understand this. Only, you know, if that is the ratio in the economy and everybody is uniformly affected, the worst affected, what do you mean by worst? 90% of those are employed in informal sector. In a baseline scenario where they are equally affected, 90% of the affected will be there from that sector. So this confusion, I find, you know, just basic confusion. The point is, it is not helpful for policy. You know, when we don't do a rigorous, just logical thinking. And I say this because we did it. We tried to propagate it, but people just don't want to listen. Everybody has their own agenda. And I hope you are not affected by the same issue. So I just mentioned it to put it on record. With that, I don't know, Charan, did we set aside time for question and answers? Or, but before we do that, or if there is time, why don't you, if you want to comment on any of you three want to comment or say something on any of the points I've made, please go ahead.
So just clarify, we have time till 3:30, so we have time for question answers.
Okay.
So after
So
they have
please, if
taken
you want to, okay. Yeah. So if you want, if any of the speakers want to comment on what I have said, including a very specific question, if there is any information.
No,
yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Rimani. This was very passionate, I must say, observations, and it seems like based on really consistent and hardcore research you're talking about. So very much appreciated. But I was going to suggest make a broader observation actually. I think in terms of taking our this kind of collaboration forward, I mean, the pandemic and its impact and long-term effect versus temporary effects, those kind of debates are certainly not over. It's not a one-off research that we presented and we move on to the next topic. I think the next year or the year after, there will be more in-depth analysis required to sort of continue the assessment of COVID and its impact and those kind of things, right? So in that vein, I think our conversation between UN-ESCAP and your think tank can actually continue. And one of the first steps I think we can potentially take, if I may suggest here, is if my colleague Lynn, for instance, or anybody from my team and one of your researchers who have actually done the research, produce a joint blog to get the word out there. There were a lot of points you were highlighting, and you can put them in a very succinct manner and then refer to detailed working papers or research papers that you have produced. Similarly, we can incorporate our references to our ongoing research, including the climate survey and those kind of things. So that would be one way, sort of, in a way, essentially summarize that and going forward, and that will help us remain engaged. And then by the time we come to the next step, I think our work we'll be having an expert group meeting sometime in November normally, where we share first draft of our next year publication with our partners and colleagues, and we'll keep, of course, EGROW in mind, and then we can go from there also. So I just wanted to observe that after listening to you, it seems that we have done some very consistent research-oriented work, and that's exactly what we're looking for to partner in terms of our collaborations. Thank you.
Yeah,
Shweta,
thank you. I'm
add?
sure, yeah, thank you for that offer. I'm sure Charan, Dr. Charan Singh will be in touch with you. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, good.
Any other points by Shweta or?
Sure, Dr.
Yeah.
Vimani, actually. So I really enjoyed your intervention, actually. You had very interesting points to make about when you're talking about the public health, what exactly public health means and stuff like that, and what is disaster risk management. I just wanted to answer a couple of things that you mentioned. One was you were saying why are infection rates and all these kind of things, cases per unit of population are so different across countries. I think partly because it depends on their health systems, basically how much they've been spending on health and how good their health systems are. But some of the East Asian countries that had experienced SARS before were a little bit better off in terms of dealing with this new pandemic because they'd already dealt with one before. So in terms of, and with new technology coming in, contact tracing and all sorts of things, they were up on the technology and doing these kind of things a lot faster than a lot of other countries. So that's why you would find sort of differences in infection rates and cases actually across Asia Pacific, so to speak. Now, coming to this K-shaped recovery, I know you're saying that everybody was affected. Everybody was affected, but not exactly the same way. Lots of people lost their jobs, but we didn't. We continued to work from home, right? And that's the whole idea behind this K-shape. People who are doing well, they continue to do well because we have jobs that we can work from home. We have access to internet. But then when schooling, just as an example, when schooling went online, there's so many people, actually kids who were literally kicked out of school basically now because they don't have access to internet. Even if they had access to internet, they don't have access to a computer to actually log on. So all these things have an impact basically on the kind of recovery. Now, one point you make, and actually that's something I could argue a little bit more because that's actually based on a lot of my research, something Charan and I, we were talking about at the beginning. Now, my research actually has shown basically it came out in the AER paper in 2008, which showed that shocks tend to have a permanent effect on output. And now at that time, it was very interesting to note what is permanent. And you're talking about how much is permanent and how much is temporary output loss and all these kinds of things, right? And it is a little bit about the semantics about how you're defining what exactly is permanent or not. So I remember at the time when we came out with the paper back in 2005 as a working paper, and then we were presenting, and lots of different works were coming from Guillermo Calvo and all these guys and Reinhardt. So they all define actually, and Reinhardt and Rogoff still define actually a recovery sort of as long as you come back to the pre-shock level of output. Okay. So if you were at 100, you went down to 80 by the time, like in 5 years, 3 years, 2 years, whatever, you come back to 100, wherever you started off, that's recovery. Okay. And it was more a matter of, and I remember Guillermo Calvo, he came to the IMF and he presented his own paper about if you remember this paper on Phoenix miracles, I think, was it Phoenix miracles or something like that? Rising from the ashes, basically. And he spent a lot of time defining how he's defining his recovery and how we define actually. So in Serra and Saxena, we define recovery actually as something that once the shock dissipates, do you get back actually to the trend that you would have been in the absence of the shock? Okay. And that is, our results showed across 90 countries basically that all financial crises, banking crisis, currency crisis, political crises, where you had changes in government and where you had civil wars, you actually tend to find a drop in output, and output never goes back even after 10 years back to the level, pre-trend level, okay? So that's for us is basically a permanent loss in output, because if you didn't have the shock, you probably would have been somewhere on that sort of trend. So it's a shift in trend. And over time, I mean, zillions of papers have done the same thing, and they've never found recovery per se, basically. Here and there in some episode or something you will find, but this is a result that holds across countries, across shocks, okay? So on this one, it is also more interesting than in some of the recent work that Blanchard, Olivier Blanchard, Summers, they had done. What they found was not actually is the fact that you're on a lower trend level, lower output path, but even your growth tends to be even lower than pre-crisis. So that means you are actually not even on a parallel path to the previous trend path, but you're actually diverging away from it. And so and they did it on I think 25 advanced economies or 30 advanced economies, and they found that not that the countries do not actually ever get back to the pre-crisis trend level, they actually over time really move away from that. Okay. And there are lots of reasons for which actually Summers describes as hysteresis, whatever you want to call it, that, you have a shock and you never recover from that. And that effect of that shock is permanent, so to speak. The word hysteresis came along back in the 80s, 1986, when Blanchard and Summers had coined this term, basically saying that, in Europe, when unemployment went up, it actually stayed up for a long time. And that this is what the hysteresis phenomenon they were calling. But interestingly enough, we have seen after the global financial crisis, countries never went back to the pre-crisis trend level. And even that time, Dr. Virmani, when were you at the IMF? In the ED?
2009 to 2012. And Shweta, I remember discussing this paper with you at length. And I would request you to consider delivering a talk on EGROW in August on this paper. We would like you to come and speak to us on your rigorous research. I thought you did it with Sarah Valerie, yeah? So I remember this paper very clearly, and the way you showed the diversions and it's sort of a branching out and that getting flattened. So even in this report, I noticed that you have brought that in, but probably the focus of the report was a little separate, so you haven't gone in detail in that. I would request you to please consider coming to us, even if you could come earlier and Valerie wants to join you. We are happy we have a slot in July also, but we would be really interested in this research. And Dr. Virmani's research, which he was mentioning, is on our website. In April 2020 is the paper where he divided it into essential, contact, and rest. And I think that's a great paper to refer to. Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't want to disrupt you, but because
so right. So the paper, the effects are. I have not, I think perhaps I have not understood, but I think that's very useful for everybody to hear about that, this experience which you worked on and which you are thing. But I just want to make 2 points, because the question is not that people are speaking wrong. They are not. So when I talk about the wealth effect, there is absolutely 0% doubt that there are social issues which have arisen. That is not the point I'm making. It's clear that if you are a poorer person, you don't have savings to fall on, you will suffer a permanent damage because you have to rebuild your wealth. There is no doubt about that. What I am saying is, if you do the proper economic analysis, you will be able to say better what the policy response should be and what is going to happen in the future. That is my point. Because if you just focus on the social issues, you won't get this. Because the effect is coming through drawdown of savings. My savings were also drawn down. So we do a precise paper, the paper on fiscal and monetary policy, and show what was the effect during lockdown. So that if people had read that, they would have had better policy. But what we heard here in India and everywhere else was, oh, give a big stimulus. We showed in that paper that stimulus during a lockdown is the stupidest thing you can think of. It doesn't work. It won't work. And that's what that's the point I'm kind of making. You have to get into the details of the thing. And unless you divide into these 3 sectors, you do not understand it.
No,
so that is one point. The second point, by the way, as I said, we did a lot of work on the epidemics. And what actually it turns out is that people have looked at the epidemic. I haven't. But people have looked at the epidemic and they found it somewhat different from the financial crisis. Okay, so you are 100% right about the economic crisis which you have investigated. But it turns out that epidemics are slightly different. They found 2 types of countries. Okay, one where there were large number of deaths. The supply side was affected. They had permanent damage. But there were countries which had a lot of cases or whatever, but didn't have a lot of deaths. There is no change in the labor force, so there's no change in the supply side. then it becomes a temporary effect, it turns out. So that's a special thing which comes from epidemics. Now, in a, when you have a tsunami, you can see the stuff is destroyed, right? You're going to be worse off, okay? But in the, as I said, unless one goes into depth on these issues, you don't get the right policy. We are policy people.
I agree with
we
you.
don't do research just for publication. In
No,
fact, we
I
don't
totally
even bother
agree
to
with you.
publish, actually.
No, I
So
agree
what
with
our
you.
basic concentration is on what is the policy? What should we do? And unless we understand the problem, there are hundreds of people. I don't mean you. I mean, every day on Twitter, I see hundreds of suggestions, all nonsense. They have no clue about what they are talking. Okay. So that's the point I was trying to get across. It's not a critique of your work. I don't even know.
No, it is not actually. It's, I don't.
I have not read the presentation or that. So again, as I said, what you are saying is absolutely correct in the areas which you have researched. Right.
No, but actually,
So any more point? Any other point?
Even on the pandemic, actually, the research definitely shows, and why this even pandemic can have a long-term impact, because there are still hysteresis channels that are working through. It's the impact on the labor market. It's the impact actually of long-term uncertainty for a long time, impact on investment, and that's going to actually have an impact on your long-term output and productivity. So it's not necessarily. And by the way, the current pandemic, the way it has happened.
Shweta, if I may intervene, I think in the interest of time, let's, if I may suggest, just open the floor and see if other participants want to share the research on the subject, or have any observations on the presentation, or things like that.
Right. Thank you. So Charan, why don't you take over and see what the questions are? And
we welcome questions. I don't see many on the chat. So if you have questions, either raise your hand or put them on the chat. In the meantime, I would like to mention that we on EGROW, we have a blog. We have just started, keeping in mind exactly the concerns which have been mentioned. And so the blog is working. The working papers that Dr. Virmani was mentioning to, they're on our website. And what I will do, Shweta, after this meeting is over, I'll send you a link of all of them, so you can have a look at, because we have spent lots of time thinking, discussing amongst ourselves. And I tell you, one of the best papers that you will see there, apart from the COVID analysis, the vision paper that we have, right? So I'm going to send you a link of all that how as a policy we are thinking of now coming out of this situation, and which are the areas we need to look at. Now, I have two questions. One is, I'm keen to learn from all of you, because you have so much of international experience within the country, because suddenly the income has taken a shock. There are negative growths. Revenues have suffered. As you know, the fiscal policy is struggling to survive. Suddenly the interest burden has shot up, right? So we are all talking of debt to GDP ratio. But if you look at interest to expenditure ratio or interest to revenue ratio, it's become very high. Now that nobody can go back on the interest payments, because in a civilized society and rating agencies watching you, that's becoming a major concern. And I was wondering, if I was in the private sector, if the government was the private government, they would have gone for restructuring their debt, or they would have, in terms of restructuring, most of the time we think in terms of rescheduling. But here, the need would be, because pandemic, Shweta, going with your own research, and also going with the length of the 1918 pandemic, which is, and of course it got mixed with the World War, but it does last, the impact does last 2 to 7 years. Now, the interest burden is so large and nothing can be done with it. How do you restructure the loan in terms of reduction in interest? So that is one challenge which I'm thinking now, and I was wondering if you have some solutions to that. The other question is that in India, suddenly some people have started talking that, well, if you do not have, you have a fiscal constraint, why don't you print money and come out of this in the course of recovery. So I was wondering, because you have done a cross-country study, do you have any observations on these two?
On the, what was the last point you were making, Charan? Can you repeat
Print money and get out of it,
that?
right? So I have defended it on a national TV, saying this is not the way out. But then I'm sure people in other countries that you have covered in your study, you might have found similar
Actually,
alternative suggestions. So do you have any views on these two?
Hamza, you go ahead. Actually, if you have any views on any of
Yeah, I can take that second one in particular. I used to be a central banker and heading the monetary
Exactly.
policy of Pakistan for about 8 years. And this is precisely the kind of debates we have had there as well in different contexts. Print the money and solve all your problems somehow. We have actually alluded, there's a separate report that ESCAP produces called our theme study. It focused on many, many areas, but our focus was on how to create fiscal space. And in that vein, we actually listed down a whole bunch of policies that can actually facilitate creating fiscal space so spending can be channeled towards COVID-related spendings. And one aspect we did highlight there is the possibility of, I wouldn't use the term printing of money. People use it very loosely. When you look at the balance sheet of a central bank, you have to speak in a little more specific terms. What do you mean by that? Creating money, essentially. Printing money is different. I'll explain in very simple terms my views on that. What we have argued and suggested there is, given the unprecedented nature of the shock, there is room for central bank to support fiscal authority in expanding the spending needs. What I mean by that is, central banks can buy already issued securities issued by the governments. This is not strictly speaking printing money, but this is still not conventional monetary policy thinking that central bank is now buying government securities in the market, in the secondary market in particular.
So
what it does is actually,
so just that's exactly the unconventional monetary
Exactly. This was
policy,
UMP. Exactly.
expanding the balance sheet
it's a quantitative
Bank of
easing
England
version.
did,
Yes.
US did, Euro did, right?
Yes.
So
Precisely.
the point that you are making is monetizing the deficit in some way. The point
No,
that
it's
came
not.
up here.
That's what I'm saying. It's in the sense of the balance sheet of the central bank. You're not creating money. It's a liquidity injection part, which is called net domestic asset part, that is created. Central banks can manage that through open market operations. So it's not the equivalent. What it does actually is creating short-term temporary liquidity in the system and give room, a breathing space to the government side. It's very similar to, like you said, quantitative easing measures. There are the differences in details, but primarily it's the same thing. Having said that, in a way, cautiously in favor of this kind of approach, governments can consider that. We list down many other options. For instance, reprioritizing some of the spending. Don't spend on defense, reduce the spending and channel towards other investments, for instance. But more importantly, we also highlighted the negative impacts of such policies. You were mentioning the impact on interest rates, for instance, or COVID-related share of interest expenses in the government's budget, right? That is, again, is one area, what is called financial repression. Prolonged support by central bank to fiscal authority ends up creating financial repression by keeping interest rates artificially low. It creates misallocation of capital, many other issues. And I've seen, as a central banker, this thing actually happening in practice. A lot of dead industries continue to survive because they keep getting these far below market interest rates access, supported by governments, and it's not productive, to use a very economic term over here. So in unprecedented circumstances, our recommendations are cautiously in favor. However, government should be fully aware of the consequences. One of them, of course, is the financial repression. Other one, which is very pertinent in South Asia, what I call is moral hazard problem. You give a sort of easy way out to the fiscal authority not to reform their side and rely on cheap money, easily accessible resources. And it actually postpones some of the very long overdue reform that they have to do. For instance, I know in Pakistan, the tax revenues ratios are far too low. And there are ratio of direct to indirect taxes is nowhere near any reasonable average, right? So by bailing fiscal authority out, essentially central banks delay these kind of things, and I call it a moral hazard problem. So this is just one of the two. We highlighted 5 or 6 problems there.
Do
Actually,
send
can
us
I just complete the
do,
circle on what Hamza was saying? It's very interesting.
yeah.
Hamza, you
But
mentioned.
I'll
do
share the
send us,
chapter. Sure.
do send
I'll
us
share the
that
chapter.
chapter. And
I
I
will.
would like to make a distinction here, which has not again been made in literature, but I was thinking, see, when the balance sheet of the US, Euro, and the UK expanded under the unconventional monetary policy, where the balance sheet expanded from 1 trillion to nearly 5 trillion, two things happened. One is the government securities that they were buying back. One is the private sector bonds and documents that they were buying. They basically the bonds. Now these two have a different impact on the economy. Of course, the liquidity part improves, but then also pumps in lots of money into the private sector, right? So this distinction and the implications of each one of them. One more thing, Hamza, which you probably mentioned, but I had a different view on this. The moral hazard problem comes in normal times, not when pandemic has hit you and sources have dried. But during the pandemic, I thought the implication is it could be very inflationary because you just pumping in money. It is something like what we have discussed in economic literature as helicopter drop-off money, and therefore it is straightway inflationary. So that was what my thought was. But then I was looking at a distinction between the two. One is monetizing of the deficit, and the other is printing of the money. Now, as the pandemic developed and people started talking of sources of finances for the government, and then the borrowing requirements with the whole world under this pandemic, and your borrowing requirements to that extent get restricted. You could buy domestically or externally. Both have different implications, but borrowing is borrowing, whereas printing could mean something more than borrowing. So I was trying to make that distinction, and I'm not sure, I haven't thought through this, but this has come up, and I was wondering if you have thought through this and seen what this distinction would mean. Pandemic and non-pandemic period, monetizing and printing. Sorry. Now, this was in the discussion with Hamza, but Shweta, you wanted to say something. Please
No,
go
actually,
ahead.
when Hamza was mentioning that, this was very interesting when he talked about, like, the financial repression. For the longest time, it was Reinhardt who would actually say, what under unconventional monetary policy all the developed countries have done is pretty much actually artificially they've kept the interest rates too low. And she said back in the old days when developing countries did that, we called that financial repression.
Yeah. Exactly. The McKinnon point was exactly this. McKinnon point was this, and now you have everything at zero rate of interest. Now, what is the concept of liquidity trap that we have? The US, Euro, England, what is the rate of interest there? And I'm sure this is leading to financial repression. Totally agree with you.
Yeah. So it was quite interesting. But actually, recently there's this guy in FT who looks at actually the stock market, sort of like, how it's been behaving compared to how Japan was. It's eerily very, very similar to before they had the collapse, and finally they've never recovered, sort of like, but you can always say that, somehow US has always been very different from Japan, right? So they might not actually experience the same kind of depression for the last 30 years that they've been going through. But it's quite interesting to actually note that he has these charts actually where he plots. It's eerily similar to what Japan was going through at the time before their crisis in the late 80s. But anyways,
any question? Yeah.
Any other question? Yeah. Any other question? Actually, just
share
a couple of your EGROW papers with us. Actually, it would be very interesting to see some of your EGROW papers on the COVID one.
We will send them. We'll send them to you. Yeah. And this discussion, of course, has been interesting. And as I said, we are going to strengthen our blog, as suggested by Hamza. We are going to strengthen our blog in the next 2-3 days because we've been writing on Twitter here and there. We'll bring them all together and we'll bring it onto our blog, so you will be able to look at it. Now, any other question, please, from the audience? There is one question from Hamad. Hamad, would you like to ask your question yourself? And the question that you have asked is very interesting. Shweta, let him ask the question, and I have a supplement to that. So, Mr. Hamad, do you want to ask your question? And then I'll add my portion, which is a supplement to that.
I wanted to ask what would be the impact of COVID-19 on petroleum products. As we know, the whole world is under lockdown. So I just wanted to ask, like, the prices of petrol went down suddenly last year, right?
Yes.
It went down. It went down suddenly last year, right? So yet we still see a skyrocketing price in India. Why so?
Actually,
So, Shweta, my supplement question to that is, his question is pertaining to petroleum products. My question was, the behavior of gold during this pandemic has been very different from what I would have expected. It went all over. And
That's
I was so
true.
surprised what's happening to gold, right?
That's
So these two I thought we could ask you if you have anything. There's
Okay.
another question which has come. I'm just placing it
Sure.
before
Please.
all of you so that you can decide which one to answer given the time frame. The question is on, given your cross-country experience, how has China tackled this situation on the economic front? Would you have something to share with us on that?
Okay, so let me actually just handle the first one first, actually, about the oil prices. So your question about this is basically that oil prices were going down, but somehow they've been actually high in India, right? They haven't gone down in India. Is that right? Was that the question, right, Sharon?
This question.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, that was the question precisely.
Right, so they haven't gone down in India, basically. So a lot of the times actually it would happen in countries that tend to your own petroleum prices at the pump do not match the international prices. Basically, it all depends on how much tax do you have on oil. And I think Charan can tell me, actually, I think India does have fossil fuel taxes. Basically, it has tax on gasoline, and that's part of the reason why when international prices tend to go down, actually you don't tend to see the same one to one, like translation in your prices at the pump. Okay, unlike other countries where if their taxes are not that much, then you would definitely see. So that's part of the reason, actually, you would not see so much of a fall in price. However, recently prices would be rising because I think OPEC has decided that they want to cut supply. I think in the recent meeting they've decided, they also have to keep the prices up, basically, in order to have their own profit basically share and stuff like that. So prices might not fall further despite the fact there's a fall in demand, because petroleum depends on both supply and demand. While demand is low because of the pandemic, but supply, actually, if it comes down, it's not going to come down. The prices are not going to come down. So that's about the oil. I do not know how gold is behaving. I know it's been going all over the place, Sharon, because I know from my family that has been talking about the gold prices. I don't actually look at the gold prices, but I know that they've been all over the place. And normally you would have just expected a secular rise, right? Right? I don't know. I don't have any good reason and answer for that one. On the China side of how China has dealt with this pandemic a lot better, actually, in general, the economic side also, basically. I think, given first of all, it was easier for China to deal with the pandemic with a very strict lockdown that it instituted right at the beginning, something China could do very effectively, and I think that helped. Then I don't know. Let me bring in Zheng. Zheng, do you have anything particular to share about anything particular they did on terms of the economic policy?
Yes, on the economic policy, how did they handle the
How did they
fiscal and
handle it?
monetary? And what is the story on the deficit and debt and the taxes? How have they done it? I think maybe something to learn.
Zheng?
Yeah.
Zheng, are you there? Actually, do you have anything to share?
Yeah.
Actually?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah. Okay. So I can only just share a little bit that I know, because I'm not closely following like the China's own like policy during the crisis. But in terms of the economic response, China did like deploy a lot of like very targeted policy interventions at the beginning of the crisis. That's including both the spending side and also then the revenue side. So China provided like very targeted tax cuts and exemptions or holidays to certain sectors, including the SMEs, including some high-tech sectors and including some like labor-intensive sectors that were mostly affected by the pandemic. On the spending side, there are also supportive programs like to the businesses and of course the government spending on infrastructure accelerated in the past year just to compensate for the loss in private demand and private economic activities. Also that China, because of its unique financial system, which the government has a lot of leverage in terms of the provision of financing to businesses. So that part was already also China deployed like more targeted policies in terms of the loans to businesses in like certain sectors, also to offset some of the negative impacts of the pandemic. However, like China was in a process of deleveraging of its economy, so that is to like at the aggregate level, China still wants to bring down the financial leveraging in this business sector, like as a medium-term or long-term objective. So it did not choose to flood the economy with excessive liquidity. So it like chose to deal this in a very selective and targeted approach. So that's kind of the intervention that I know.
Okay, so more targeted rather than being something general, basically, is your take on it?
Yeah. So in general, I think the swift control of the pandemic would still be the most important factor in China's like relatively less economic like suffering during the pandemic, because like after the initial wave was contained, it could quickly open up the economy and restart the production, and then it could capitalize on the global demand like surge in terms of like electronic devices, these medical supplies, so on and so forth, while the production of other parts of the world were hurt by the pandemic. So China like was able to fill in the gap. So this the export during the later half of 2020 also helped this economic recovery and stabilization.
Thanks, Cheng, actually. Yeah.
That was interesting, and I think that's very useful. And I probably, going by the past experience, totally agree that the pharma and the industries like the concentrators, oximeters, and all those must have made an impact in the recovery in China. With this, I think we have come to the end of this webinar. I want to thank each of the speakers, Hamza, Shweta, and Lynn, who spoke and gave us their views. I think we have had a very, very active question answer session, very participative and very informative. That's the very purpose of interaction of thoughts and invoking thoughts so that we can think beyond the current topic that we have in hand. I would like to close with one request to Shweta, repetitive of course. I would like her to come and speak at EGROW with her paper at the American Economic Review. She has the choice to decide the date at her convenience. We would be so happy to host her, and this discussion will continue. We will have today's discussion available on our website, and I'll send the links to you, Shweta. It will be available, the recording will be available, and we would like to, because the discussion has been so rich, we would like more and more people to listen to this and benefit from it. In continuation of the EGROW's policy-oriented discussions, tomorrow we have Dr. Anthony speaking to us at 5:30 Indian Standard Time on health issues. Dr. Ratan is going to be chairing. Dr. Ratan is a World Bank consultant and a veteran on health issues in our country. He will be chairing that session. And on Monday, we have something on MSMEs. Professor Bala from Indian Institute of Science and Professor Sinha, again from Bangalore, with vast experience in MSME lending, will be talking about the post-COVID MSME scenario. I'm sure these topics will interest you. The timing is 5:30 to 6:30 p.m. tomorrow and on Monday. I would invite all of you to spare some time and listen to it. I would like to thank now all the participants who have been with us today to discuss this UN-ESCAP report, an excellent report and eye-opener for all of us. And once again, thanking Mr. Hamza, Shweta, and Lynn to be with us and present here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Arun, for hosting us. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you. It was very engaging.
Very interesting.
Exactly.
Yes,
Yeah,
very-
quite engaging. Exactly. I have to say.
Very engaging discussion, exactly, on an afternoon on a Friday.
Reminds us good old days of
Totally,
pandemic research.
totally awake. Totally awake.